President Trump ousted Pam Bondi from her role as U.S. Attorney General as well. Sources tell CBS News her removal was due to multiple frustrations, including her handling of the Epstein files. In a social media post, the president said Bondi will move to a, quote, important new job in the private sector, yet to be announced. President Trump named Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche to step in and serve as acting AG. Blanche is a former federal prosecutor who worked as Mr. Trump's criminal defense attorney. In an interview with Fox News, Blanche defended Bondi's tenure.
We are a better Justice Department. We are safer as a nation, and we should all be very grateful to the Attorney General for her sacrifice for this country and for what she did.
CBS News senior White House correspondent Weijia Zhang joins us now for more on Bondi's removal from the DOJ. Good morning, Weijia. So why exactly was this close ally of the president fired?
What's up, guys? Welcome to Dr. John Podcast. So this is what just happened, guys. Trump has fired Pam Bondi, not over policy, not a routine reshuffle. The Epstein files spun out of control. Pages referencing Trump's name, his private communications, his associations with Epstein kept disappearing into bureaucratic black holes, only to resurface in the hands of congressional investigators.
Well, good morning, Errol. So this is the second time in less than 1 month that President Trump ousted a member of his cabinet for a variety of reasons that we will get to. In a statement, Bondi said she will be, quote, moving to an important private sector role. She says she's thrilled about it and she will continue fighting for President Trump and the administration.
There is no greater president than Donald Trump.
Pam Bondi was a fierce and unflinching defender of President Trump. She ran a Justice Department that investigated frequent Trump targets like Letitia James, James Comey, and Jerome Powell.
And Pam, I think, thank you. What a great job.
Bondi, despite her loyalty and her years of defending him on television, couldn't stop the bleeding. So he removed her. The Attorney General he installed to protect him became the person he needed protection from. To understand why this firing is sending seismic tremors through the entire political landscape, you have to look at the impossible tightrope Bondi was ordered to walk from the very first day she took the job.
But that loyalty was not enough to save her job as the nation's top law enforcement official. Just one day after the president and Bondi attended a Supreme Court hearing together, Trump announced her departure Thursday and praised Bondi for overseeing a massive crackdown on crime across our country, adding, "We love Pam." Trump did not always love the way Bondi handled the Jeffrey Epstein case after she promoted conspiracy theories about a possible Epstein client list.
It's sitting on my desk right now to review. That's been a directive.
She later said it never existed.
There was no client list.
And last September, the president also complained publicly that Bondi didn't succeed in prosecuting his political rivals. Pam, all talk, no action. Nothing is being done.
I think serving as President Trump's attorney general is a hazardous business. And
Tom Dupree served as a deputy assistant attorney general under President George W. Bush.
Her failing was not a lack of loyalty. It was a failure to execute. The president made clear from day one that a top priority of his was using the Justice Department as a way to go after the people he felt had treated him wrongly.
Trump named Bondi's former top deputy, Todd Blanche, as acting attorney general, but sources tell CBS News that EPA administrator and former New York Congressman Lee Zeldin is a frontrunner to take the post permanently. This week, Zeldin met privately with Trump.
She was installed as the chief law enforcement officer of the United States with a very explicit and very personal mission handed down by Trump himself. She was supposed to be the tip of the spear in a long-awaited and loudly promised campaign of retribution. Trump came roaring back into power with a list of names burned into his psyche, names of people he believes wronged him, targeted him, and tried to destroy his first presidency.
It's official. Pam Bondi is out as Attorney General. Trump announced today that she'll be transitioning to a new job in the private sector. In other words, she's been canned. And there were a lot of reasons to fire Pam Bondi. There were plenty of moments from her ignominious career, tenure as Attorney General that you could choose from. But there was one moment that I couldn't stop thinking about today. Happened back in February when Bondi was asked in Congress why she had not prosecuted any of Jeffrey Epstein's co-conspirators. And she said this.
This administration released over 3 million pages of documents, over 3 million, and Donald Trump signed that law. to release all of those documents. He is the most transparent president in the nation's history. And none of them asked Merrick Garland over the last 4 years one word about Jeffrey Epstein. How ironic is that? You know why? Because Donald Trump, the Dow right now is over $50,000. I don't know why you're laughing.
Through what he has always characterized as a deep state witch hunt, James Comey, John Brennan, Sally Yates, an entire roster of former intelligence officials and FBI personnel who were involved in the Russia investigation, all of them were marked for prosecution. Trump had made this promise to the roaring crowds at his rallies, a promise of accountability that his base interpreted as a blood oath for vengeance.
Yeah, that Dow was in her burn book. She needed to get that comment out. The Dow is over 50,000. That's why she couldn't prosecute any of the co-conspirators in Jeffrey Epstein's child sex trafficking crimes, because the Dow was just too damn high. Ironically, the Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped below 50,000 points the following day and never broke that threshold again. It's currently down about 3,600 points from that high point, thanks to Trump's war of choice in Iran. But I digress. Pam Bondi's attempt to dodge questions about Epstein by screaming about the stock market immediately turned her into a laughingstock. That moment spawned 1,000 memes across the internet, all mocking the absurdity of Bondi's failed attempt to change the subject. It moment became a perfect encapsulation of the impossible situation that Pam Bondi found herself in. Trump hated the Epstein files were getting so much attention. He called the whole thing a hoax. He wanted it just to go away. So Bondi was trying to downplay the issue out of loyalty to Donald Trump. The problem was that she had already lost all credibility on the issue, because at the start of Donald Trump's second term, Bondi teased the MAGA base by telling them that she had obtained a list of Jeffrey Epstein's clients.
Bondi was the person he tapped to turn that promise into a legal reality. She had the background as Florida's Attorney General, she had the television presence, and she had the vocal loyalty that Trump prizes above almost any other qualification. She was supposed to flip the switch and make the prosecutorial machinery of the Justice Department move with the speed of a political campaign.
And one of the things that you alluded to, and this is something Donald Trump has talked about, the DOJ may be releasing the list of Jeffrey Epstein's clients. Will that really happen?
It's sitting on my desk right now to review.
It's sitting on my desk right now to review. Then, 5 months later, Bondi walked that statement back, saying that actually there was no Epstein client list and no files would be released. That self-inflicted wound never healed. We later learned from the Wall Street Journal that Bondi had already informed the president that his name was all over the Epstein files. And it was right around that time that Trump started publicly referring to the whole Epstein issue as a hoax. Now, by that time, Bondi was already facing backlash from a skeptical MAGA base, and she was running out of options. She couldn't release files that might implicate her boss, she couldn't credibly cover it up, and she couldn't satisfy a political base that demanded transparency. And so the Epstein file scandal spiraled out of the administration's control.
But here is where the gears of the story take a dark and irreversible turn. While Bondi was trying to manage the immense pressure of Trump's personal demands for retribution, while she was receiving handwritten memos from the president demanding to know why these prosecutions were not moving faster, why his enemies were not already in handcuffs.
The public outcry was so overwhelming, Trump was effectively forced to sign a law mandating the release of the files. That's not what she called Donald Trump being the most transparent president ever. He was forced to do that. Pam Bondi was forced to at least to pretend that she was complying with that order, even as her office delayed the release of the files and then got caught over and over again, holding back key documents that should have been released, including documents containing stunning though unsubstantiated, accusations that Donald Trump sexually assaulted a minor. And while the Epstein files were clearly a big part of why Trump became frustrated with Pam Bondi, they were not the only reason. Trump publicly demanded that Bondi bring baseless charges against his rivals, and Bondi dutifully complied. Her Justice Department tried to bring charges against the New York Attorney General Letitia James, against Senator Adam Schiff, against the former FBI Director James Comey, against the Chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell. But one by one, those prosecutions fell apart under the weight of their own stupidity. Judges and grand juries saw how weak the cases actually were and recognized the political motives behind them. Bondi's failure to prosecute Trump's enemies and her failure to make the Epstein files go away all made her the victim of a new Trump-era phenomenon. She was fired for being too loyal to the president.
Why the administration was looking weak and incapable of delivering justice. Another monster was stirring in the filing cabinets. The full release of the Jeffrey Epstein documents had been set into motion by congressional mandate. We are talking about 3.5 million pages of raw, unfiltered documentation related to the operations, the associations, and the hidden network of one of the most infamous figures in the world. And Donald Trump's name is threaded through that archive. His visits to Palm Beach, his friendly correspondence.
Because you see, in Donald Trump's first term, he fired or effectively pushed out all sorts of people, including 2 attorneys general, when he deemed them to be insufficiently loyal. And so, in Trump's second term, all of his cabinet members have worked overtime. I don't know if you ever watched one of these cabinet meetings. It's fascinating. They've worked overtime to prove their loyalty by trying to carry out whatever Trump wants, no matter how absurd or how outrageous or how illegal. But in the case of Pam Bondi, her effort to remain loyal at any cost destroyed what little credibility she did have, which made her so ineffective that she was eventually useless to Donald Trump. In many ways, it's similar to what happened with Trump's Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, or the Border Patrol Commander, Greg Bovino, both of whom tried to prove their loyalty by aggressively carrying out Donald Trump's cruel deportation agenda at any cost. But in doing so, they became cartoon villains, ridiculed by late-night comics and in viral memes. Ultimately, their zealous loyalty to Trump's agenda is what made them less useful to Trump and more expendable. We've seen the same thing from Trump's Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, who's embarrassed herself through her efforts to prove Donald Trump's baseless election lies from 2020. We're still litigating that. And by abandoning her opposition to war with Iran in order to serve Donald Trump's interests.
His documented social interactions with Epstein, all of it had been locked away from public view for years. And suddenly, Bondi was the one holding the keys to the vault. She was caught in an impossible vice. On one side, Congress was screaming for complete transparency, demanding an unredacted dump of everything. And on the other side sat a president who was visibly terrified that his past associations were about to be excavated and displayed for the world to see. The disaster that followed was not a subtle failure of bureaucratic management.
The Guardian reported today that Trump is polling his advisors about whether Gabbard should be fired as well. That's according to 2 people who are familiar with those discussions. And just before we came on the air, The Atlantic reported that Trump is considering firing a spate of other officials, including loyalists like FBI Director Kash Patel and the labor leader, Lori Chavez DeRemer. That's according to several people familiar with the matter. So what exactly is happening here? Absolute loyalty was supposed to be the thing that prevented Donald Trump's officials from getting fired, but it's become something of a trap. And that's not a problem just for Trump's cabinet. It's a problem for Trump himself. Trump has done nothing to solve his Epstein problems by firing Pam Bondi. And while his personal vendettas have corrupted the DOJ, he hasn't actually gotten closer to actually locking any of his political enemies up.
It was a spectacular, slow-motion implosion that played out on the biggest stage imaginable. Bondi attempted to thread the needle by releasing the documents in a format that was supposedly designed to protect sensitive privacy information. But the redactions were so aggressive, so heavy-handed, so utterly absurd in their scope that the files she released to the public and to Congress were effectively hollow shells. The pages that mattered, the bombshells that investigators had been digging for, the sections that actually explained the nature of the relationships Epstein cultivated with powerful men, were either blacked out into oblivion or missing entirely. Congress did not simply roll over and accept this sanitized offering. Lawmakers erupted in fury. angry. They read blistering statements into the record demanding the complete and unaltered files, accusing the Justice Department of participating in a cover-up, and the narrative that Bondi was supposed to control flipped violently against her. Instead of being seen as the loyal soldier who was cleaning up the deep state swamp, she was suddenly branded as the incompetent gatekeeper who had botched the most consequential document release of the decade. The perception of her competence cratered, and the whispers about what exactly was being hidden started to grow louder from every corner of the political ecosystem. Just when it seemed the situation could not possibly become more catastrophic for Bondi's career, she stepped into a congressional hearing room and detonated her own credibility in a clip that would go viral within minutes. Representative Jamie Raskin, a relentless interrogator with a legal mind sharpened to a razor's edge, pinned her down on the missing documents. He pressed her on why the files were so incomplete. He demanded answers about the nature of the redactions and the location of the specific records that tied Trump directly to Epstein. Bondi, trapped in a pressure cooker of her own making and unable to provide a legally satisfying answer without incriminating her boss or admitting to a cover-up, broke. She called Representative Raskin a washed-up loser right there on camera, live, in the middle of an official congressional proceeding. The internet swallowed that clip whole and spat it back out as a million memes. News networks looped the footage. Social media algorithms pushed it to the top of every trending feed. Late-night hosts had their monologues written for them. Donald Trump, who watches everything, who monitors the television coverage of his administration with an obsessive intensity, saw his attorney general having an emotional meltdown on national television, calling a sitting congressman names like a cable news pundit rather than acting like the chief legal officer of the federal government. In that moment, the calculation shifted. Bondi was no longer an asset who could quietly massage the Epstein problem away. She was a walking liability, a living symbol of the chaos she was supposed to be suppressing, and Trump made the decision that his inner circle had been expecting for days. She was fired, gone, erased from the masthead. Trump called it a transition, a planned move toward a new direction. But nobody in Washington bought that spin for a single second. The insiders knew exactly what had happened. The Epstein files situation had spiraled so far beyond Bondi's ability to control it that the only remaining move was to cut her loose like a frayed tow rope. Trump's personal connections to Jeffrey Epstein were now being discussed in terms that no amount of redaction could obscure. The full release of the documents was eventually forced by the sheer weight of congressional pressure, and when the complete unredacted pages finally hit the public domain, the evidence of Trump's relationship with Epstein was undeniable. Palm Beach visits were logged. Friendly emails were time-stamped. A pattern of social engagement that went far beyond the casual, "we briefly said hello at a cocktail party" defense was laid bare for every voter to read in black and white. The base, the immovable rock upon which Trump's entire political viability rests, started to crack. Internal polling numbers leaked out, and they were staggering. 70% of his own supporters expressed deep concern about his ties to Epstein. That is not a marginal statistical wobble. That is a foundational tremor in the bedrock of his political support. And here is the crucial element that makes this firing so much more than a single personnel decision in a chaotic administration. This did not happen in a vacuum. The removal of Pam Bondi is merely the loudest, shattering sound in a symphony of destruction that is consuming Trump's second term. While the Epstein files were exploding in one corner of the administration, the entire foreign policy apparatus was going down in flames. The situation with Iran was deteriorating at a pace that horrified national security professionals. Trump's hand-picked Vice President Mike Vance was actively and publicly breaking with him on critical issues of war spending and military deployment strategy. Republicans in Congress, the same people who once quaked at the thought of a mean tweet from the White House, were now in open and aggressive revolt against his cabinet decisions and his legislative paralysis. House Republicans were staring at internal projections that forecast a bloodbath of historic proportions, potential losses of 65 seats that would not just flip the chamber, but would obliterate their majority for a generation. Bondi's firing, in this context, is not a standalone story. It is a flashing red indicator light on a dashboard that is screaming about total engine failure. To truly grasp how we arrived at this precipice, we have to rewind the timeline and track the parallel disasters that Bondi was supposed to manage simultaneously, a juggling act that ultimately crushed her. The foundational mission assigned to her was the prosecution of Trump's enemies, a task that consumed his attention to a pathological degree. He sent her handwritten memos, personal demands scrawled in his distinctive marker, telling her that the delay in these prosecutions was damaging his reputation. He framed the failure to lock up his political adversaries as a sign of weakness that made the entire administration look impotent. Bondi was tasked with converting these demands into legally sound prosecutions, a challenge that would be almost insurmountable even in the calmest of political waters, and she was navigating it inside a hurricane. While she was trying to weaponize the Justice Department for Trump's personal vendetta, the Epstein files were physically moving through the process. Congress had demanded total transparency, a full release of all 3.5 million pages. The theory behind the release was noble enough, letting the American public see the full scope of Epstein's operations and the network of enablers who allowed his crimes to continue. But the reality was that Trump's name kept surfacing in the discovery logs. Correspondence that had been buried for years was suddenly being flagged for review. The friendly, chummy, social relationship between the two men was not a conspiracy theory whispered about on obscure forums. It was documented in handwriting and letterhead. Bondi's impossible task was to release these documents in a way that satisfied the congressional subpoenas without exposing the president's dirty laundry. The redactions she applied were a desperate attempt to black out the parts that would embarrass Trump while releasing just enough text to pretend she was complying with the law. But the redactions were so blatant, so comprehensive, that they became the story themselves. Congress took one look at the blacked out pages and demanded the originals. The pressure mounted daily, and Bondi found herself trapped in the shrinking space between a Congress that had the power of contempt and a president who had the power of termination. Then came the hearing, the public unraveling that turned Bondi from a political appointee into a viral punchline. Representative Raskin, with the methodical precision of a constitutional law professor, started asking the questions that Bondi could not answer truthfully without destroying her career or lying under oath. Where were the missing files? Why did her version of the release contain such glaring omissions? What specific criteria were used to redact the sections that mentioned Trump? Bondi had no safe harbor. She could not admit that the redactions were designed to protect the president, and she could not claim ignorance because the process had been run out of her office. Faced with the cognitive dissonance of her position, her composure shattered. The insult she hurled at Raskin was not a calculated political counterpunch. It was the raw, emotional reaction of someone who had run out of road. The clip spread like wildfire. The public spectacle of the Attorney General of the United States losing her temper and name-calling a congressman was so damaging that Trump realized the Epstein cover-up was now being debated in the context of Bondi's personal instability rather than her legal strategy. She had to go. The firing was swift, cloaked in the typical language of gratitude and transition, but the corpse of her reputation was already being buried by insiders who leaked the truth to reporters immediately. Trump was furious. The Epstein situation was out of control, and Bondi was the designated scapegoat. Now that the dust is settling on Bondi's political grave, the real fallout is only beginning to calcify, and it is far more dangerous for Trump than the loss of a single loyalist. The full Epstein files are out there now, released into the wild despite every effort to suppress them. The connections are no longer a matter of speculative journalism. Researchers are combing through the documents line by line. Investigative journalists are cross-referencing dates and flight logs with Trump's known schedule. The Palm Beach social scene that both men inhabited is being reconstructed in granular detail. The evidence shows a genuine relationship, a pattern of social interaction that contradicts the minimalization strategy Trump has used for years. This is no longer a story that can be dismissed as a partisan smear or a fringe conspiracy. The documents are now part of the official historical record, and they are accessible to anyone with an internet connection. The political fallout from this transparency is atomizing. Trump's entire brand was constructed around the idea of being a tough-on-crime, law and order strongman who would crush the corrupt elites. Seeing his own name woven into the fabric of the Epstein files creates a cognitive dissonance that is impossible to spin away. His supporters, the 70% who now express concern, are not necessarily abandoning him overnight, but the seed of doubt has been planted in the most fertile soil of his movement. When a base starts to question whether their leader has been hiding something as dark as a friendship with Epstein, the erosion of trust is almost always terminal. This erosion is accelerating because it is blending with the other catastrophic failures of the administration. The Iran debacle is proving that Trump's foreign policy instincts are not translating into stable outcomes. Vice President Vance, who was supposed to be the insurance policy for the MAGA movement's future, is now a visible antagonist on the issue of military intervention and defense appropriations. The Republican Party, which once feared Trump's primary power more than they feared electoral defeat, is now calculating that their survival depends on distance. The projections of losing 65 House seats are not just abstract numbers thrown around by nervous pollsters. They represent a fundamental realignment driven by independent voters who are disgusted by the chaos and by a demoralized base that is questioning whether the administration's promises of retribution were ever anything more than a distraction from the president's own legal and historical vulnerabilities. The Bondi firing fits into this collapse as the symbolic epicenter. She was the avatar of the retribution agenda, the person who was going to put the deep state in prison, and she failed utterly. Her failure was not just a failure of legal strategy, it was a failure of loyalty management. She was given the Epstein file assignment because Trump believed she would prioritize his personal protection over her constitutional oath. When her attempts at protection became so clumsy that they caused a congressional revolt and a viral meltdown, her utility evaporated. Trump's management style has always been to find a new person to fix the problem created by the last person. But the problem here is not staffing. You cannot fire your way out of a documentary record. 3.5 million pages do not disappear just because you change the nameplate on the Attorney General's door. The new person taking over the Justice Department will inherit the exact same impossible dilemma. The prosecutions of Trump's enemies are still not moving at the speed of a political vendetta. The Epstein files are still public. The connections between Trump and Epstein are still being discussed, shared, and analyzed by a horrified electorate. The political body language of the Republican caucus tells the rest of the story. Members of Congress are not rushing to the microphones to defend Bondi or to attack the process. They are quietly distancing themselves, whispering to donors that the administration is in a death spiral and that the midterm wipeout is already priced into their futures. The chaos is not just inside the White House gates anymore. It is spreading to every state party, every down-ballot candidate, and every fundraising email. The firing of Bondi is the moment the cover-up collapsed, and the collapse of that cover-up is the moment the past finally caught up with the president in a way that no legal motion, no executive privilege claim, and no loyalist appointment could stop. The Epstein files are the truth that Trump spent years trying to outrun. Pam Bondi was simply the last person to be crushed under the weight of that futile effort. Where does this go from here? The trajectory is grim for the administration. Bondi is gone, and her replacement will step into a Justice Department that is demoralized and viewed with suspicion by a Congress that has already tasted blood. The demand for transparency regarding Epstein will not fade because the documents are now part of the permanent conversation. Every time Trump tries to pivot to the economy or foreign policy, a new detail will surface from the files, a new photograph, a new email, a new entry in a flight log that reinforces the connection. The base will continue to fracture under the weight of these revelations because the doubt is now supported by physical documentation. The 70% concern level is a statistic that will shape primary challenges and midterm turnout in ways that are catastrophic for Republican incumbents. Meanwhile, the actual governance of the country is grinding to a halt. Foreign adversaries are watching an administration that is eating itself alive. The Iran situation requires focused diplomatic and military attention, but the White House is consumed with internal purges. The legislative agenda is dead on arrival in a Congress where Republicans are terrified to be seen standing with a president mired in Epstein-adjacent scandal. The VP's rebellion on war spending signals a fracture at the very top of the executive branch, a schism that cannot be healed by firings because the VP is elected and cannot be dismissed with a tweet. This is the true architecture of a presidency in freefall. The Bondi firing was necessary for Trump's psychological need to assert control, but it solved nothing and exacerbated everything. It drew more attention to the very files he wanted buried. It elevated the Raskin hearing clip to permanent meme status. It confirmed to his enemies that he is panicking, and it confirmed to his allies that he will sacrifice anyone to save himself. The public now has the Epstein files, the base has doubts, the party has an electoral death wish, and the president has a newly vacant attorney general's office that no competent lawyer would dare fill without an exit strategy. This is the moment when the past stops whispering and starts screaming, and no amount of personnel turnover can silence that sound.